Hello and welcome to India Speak, the podcast by the Center for Policy Research. I am Sushant Singh, Senior Fellow at CPR. It is a fast developing situation in Europe with the Russian forces just outside the Ukrainian capital. India has been walking a tightrope with its vote in the UN Security Council, particularly attracting a lot of attention globally. The usual debate between values and principles on one side and interests on the other is playing out. The Indian government is also grappling with the challenge of evacuating its citizens. Some 40% of them still remain inside Ukraine. To discuss these issues and more, I am joined by Ambassador Shyam Saran, former Indian Foreign Secretary and Senior Fellow at CPR. Ambassador Saran, welcome to India Speak. Let me begin with something very basic, Ambassador Saran. What are India's interests that are at stake in Ukraine? A safe evacuation of students, relations with Russia, relations with the United States? What exactly are these interests?
I think all over the above, in a sense, because not only, as you mentioned, is our relationship with Russia, which is going to be impacted by however this train of events concludes, but it has become an East-West confrontation, and in that East-West confrontation, we are caught right in the middle, in a sense. So there are those factors, but much more immediate is, of course, the safety and security of our students. And as you said, about 40%, I would imagine about 4,000 to 5,000 may still be within the war zone. And their safety and, bringing them back safely home, this can obviously cannot but be the most important consideration in front of our government. And this means that not only do we have to keep very closely engaged with Russia, whose forces are inside, keep engaged with Ukrainian authorities because they are still in control of several of the areas, particularly some of the border posts. And of course, the countries where they will be taking shelter or are taking shelter. So for us, the most urgent, issue for our diplomacy is really to keep all these communication channels open so that we are able to bring our people back home.
So there's been a lot of discussion that we are looking now at a post-Ukraine world. Is it true that we are looking at a post-Ukraine world? And what really are the structural changes that have taken place because of this Russian military operation in Ukraine? Or are these structural changes which are still going to play out and they're likely to take place over a long arc? And are we only looking at the beginning of what those changes are?
A transformation is taking place in Europe, in the world. And yes, we may be at the initial stages of that transformation, but I have no doubt in my mind that this transformation is here to stay, that this is not a temporary shift in geopolitics, but this represents a very major departure as far as, the post-Cold War order is concerned, both in Europe as well as in the rest of the world. And in fact, in a real sense, the post-Second War order, which has been based around the UN Charter. What we are seeing at play currently is that all the assumptions behind that kind of, international balance that, relatively speaking, kept the peace. I think those have been almost completely undermined. So I give you as an example, what was perhaps never anticipated even a week ago, that a country like Germany, which has essentially since the Second World War been a very pacifist state. It has always played a very low-key role in Europe and internationally. It had very strong kind of taboo against supply of lethal arms to conflict zones. All those have fallen by the wayside. So if you have a Germany which is now committing itself to 2% of its GDP to defense, and Germany is one of the richest countries in the world, and that it has talked about, supplying arms, in particular, anti-tank weapons, Stinger missiles, which would really be directly used to degrade the Russian forces now invading Ukraine. This is, to me, a very, very significant, and I would even say a dramatic change. Or the fact that you had post-Cold War, and even before, you had an European Union, which was an economic arrangement. You had a NATO, which was a military arrangement, a military alliance. Now you have the European Union saying that it will take on a military role, that it is also going to supply, weapons to Ukraine. So, the lines have got almost completely blurred. So let us just take, for example, the possibility that European Union will agree to the latest demand which has been made by the Ukrainian president, that, why will you not admit us into the European Union? You have said we are already a part of Europe. Admit us into the European Union. Now, if you take into account the fact that one Russian demand has been that Ukraine should not ever enter NATO, what does that mean anymore? Because even if Ukraine does not enter the European Union, enter NATO, entry into the European Union still will have a military dimension. So that's why I'm saying that many of the sort of, shall I say, anchors of the post-Second World War and later post-Cold War, anchors of the order that was in place, a predictable order, that has been almost completely undermined.
So the order, the change in this predictable order, which is taking place primarily in Europe, the upheaval in Europe, how does that connect with the challenges that India faces in the Indo-Pacific and in the Asian continent? Is there a direct linkage? Is there an indirect linkage? How will this play out for India in Asia and the Indo-Pacific?
Well, India is a major power. Therefore, India's interests are not merely with respect to what happens in Asia Pacific. India also will be impacted by whatever happens in Europe, for the simple reason that we have very, very strong stakes, economic stakes, but also political stakes. You can go a little further, that, if the United States of America is going to play a major role in this post-Ukraine order, as I think it will mean that our relations with the United States of America will also be impacted. So it is not merely a question of what will be the collateral impact in Indo-Pacific, but even in terms of the direct impact on India as a result of those dramatic changes that I spoke about. I think what we have to take into account is, if we are talking about the Indo-Pacific, the most important issue for us is, what does it mean for India-China relations? And whether Russia wins the war in Ukraine or loses the war in Ukraine, to me, the net gainer from this is China, because if the United States of America, which is its peer rival, and Western Europe are going to be, for the foreseeable future, greatly focused on managing the situation in Europe, will they have the same kind of preoccupation with the Indo-Pacific, which is somewhat far away? My sense is that even without a war situation, trying to handle confrontation on two fronts is always a very difficult, challenge. And I think you are going to see that challenge, already coming up, because China is, as you can see, blaming the West, blaming the United States for the crisis which has occurred. So you can see that it is looking at what is happening in the prism of its confrontation with the United States of America. So for China, the expectation would be that there would be much less pressure on China on its eastern flank, and this could also change calculations with regard to what China may decide to do with regard to, say, Taiwan.
And also with respect to India, because China remains the biggest strategic challenge that India faces. It continues to sit on our borders. The threat on Ladakh or in Arunachal Pradesh or in Himachal and Uttarakhand continues to remain. And the way we try to deal with it, whether through internal military rebalancing by diverting forces from the Pakistan border, or through external rebalancing via the decode, both these things now seem to be up in the air.
Well, what I would say is that there is no doubt, as I said, that there will be a heightening of the challenge that we face from China. But ultimately, what will determine our ability to deal with this, yes, external balancing, domestic balancing, but I think much more at this time, you will have to focus on domestic balancing. I think you will have to take some very key decisions in terms of ramping up your economic capabilities, ramping up your military capabilities. Only that will give you relative autonomy in the kind of decisions that you need to take. So I do not say that, what has happened in Ukraine is making, for example, the Quad irrelevant. No, I think the Quad will continue to play a very important role. Even if the United States of America is preoccupied in Europe, Japan is not, Australia is not. Several of the other friendly countries we have in the region are not. Therefore, there is even an opportunity for India to try and bring about greater crystallization, greater coherence in terms of security partnerships in the region itself, starting with Japan, starting with, Australia. So there are options available. We should not get into a mindset that, we have been left sort of exposed. I think it is a question of how do we, number one, assess the new situation, and what are the ways in which we can deal with, minimize the greater sort of salience of threats that we will face, but also look for some of the opportunities that we may have to expand our strategic space. Because I keep saying this again and again, that it is only in a period of change that opportunities arise also to try and expand your strategic space. So I think we should also look at what can be the openings, what can be the opportunities to be able to also expand our opportunities.
So the question of economic growth, which you spoke about, with these economic sanctions against Russia, with the energy prices going up, and with all the turmoil in Europe, the challenge for economic growth becomes even greater.
Most certainly. What I think we have to recognize is that whichever way you look at it, this is going to cause losses, going to cause damage all around. So it's not as if any particular international actor is going to be somehow, insulated from these negative and adverse impacts. So really the question is, who is going to lose the least rather than who is going to actually gain? Nobody is going to gain. No, not even China is going to gain. But in terms of what is the relative damage that will be done. And in that sense, yes, India will certainly be impacted by the economic disruptions that this will cause, not only in terms of our direct relations, say trade relations with Russia or Ukraine. These, at the end of the day, are not the most important. What is more important is, of course, the military and the defense relationship, and how that will be impacted. How much that will be disrupted is something that we have to look out for. Because I think if you look at, say, the 4 frigates that we have ordered from Russia, the engines apparently come from Ukraine. So there are those kind of difficulties that we are going to run up against in the coming days. But I don't think that economic damage will be, direct economic damage will be so much, because our exposure is somewhat limited. But there will be more damage because of the overall global disruptions which may take place, including the rise in oil prices that you mentioned, because we are already also in an inflationary kind of a situation building up, and this will obviously add to that inflation. So we'll have to do some very, very careful economic sort of policy making in order to try and minimize the damage to our economy. The good news is that we continue to have very good relations with major, economic powers like the United States, like with Europe, Japan in our own region, and also Southeast Asia. So how we use these partnerships, economic partnerships, to really raise the level of our own economic development, that is something that we will have to look at very, very seriously now.
But say you spoke about internal strength in terms of the economic development and the military growth and the military power. But what about the social cohesion that within India seems to be completely disrupted and it's being torn apart every single day? If we have to face these major external threats on our own, should repair of the social divisiveness, should that social cohesion not be the highest priority or the biggest priority in our case?
So, I mean, that's a no-brainer, isn't it? I mean, even if you are a very strong country, if that internal coherence is not there, then you are not going to be able to face the external challenges with the same degree of, confidence that would be perhaps possible. So, in that sense, I think it should perhaps be apparent to the decision makers in our country that is a road that we should not be traveling on. That really the slogans that the Prime Minister has put forward, which is Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas, I think these should really be translated into actual, policies of the government, because it is only when you are able to take all your people along that there will be the full strength of the country behind the government. Makes a very big difference in terms of how you relate to the rest of the world. You can't make a dividing line between what you do at home and how you project yourself externally. So that is the point that you have made is, to my mind, really a fundamental issue.
So also as a kind of a slightly sidey issue, sir, how would you look at Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan's visit to Russia during this period? And should we be worried about kind of a Russia, China, Pakistan coming together and what we're going to face on our land borders in that sense?
Well, I do not see what Pakistan can bring to the table as far as Russia is concerned. I think Russian concerns have been essentially because of the Afghan situation, and a sense that Pakistan can play an important and positive role in perhaps managing the Afghan crisis. So far, we don't see, in fact, that very much, helping. But I don't think I'm so much worried about the link with Russia as I'm worried with what this means in terms of a China-Pakistan relationship. So, if we look at what should be of major concern to us, the major concern to us is a China-Pakistan, alliance and relationship. The Russian relationship, to my mind, will be a side play going forward. I do not foresee a situation where Russia, as a matter of choice, will become part of an anti-India axis. I do not think that is going to happen. But, this is not a question of either or. In diplomacy, you work at the margins, a little more or a little less. So what you may be looking at is perhaps the evolution which we have seen, if you just take into account the change in the Russian position with regard to, say, Afghanistan in the last 10 years, from being fairly closely aligned with India, it has become much more aligned with China. Could this extend further if Russia is going to be more dependent as a result of the Ukraine, conflict on China? It could happen. But overall, if you see, there has been actually a diminution, the reduced salience of India-Russia relations since the end of the Cold War. That is unmistakable. The military relationship remains very, very important, but that is because it is of mutual interest in a sense. I think India constitutes about 36%, if I am not mistaken, of all Russian, defense exports. So there is also a good reason for Russia to keep this relationship in good repair. Going forward, is that likely to become even less important as it has been in the past? That is quite possible. But I would say that not knowing what is really going to happen, what is the way in which this conflict going to end, I would say that the relationship with Russia will remain important to India. There has been an assumption in India that whatever may be the compulsions which bring Russia and China together, long-term interests of the two countries are not necessarily aligned. That, whether it is Central Asia or whether it is Eastern Europe, two areas which Russia itself calls its near neighborhood, and perhaps even to some extent, as we see with Ukraine, almost like a core interest, as it were, who is expanding his influence the most in these regions? It is not the West, it is China. So our assumption has been that while Russian concern over this is currently muted because of the pressure Russia faces from the West, long term, perhaps their interests may not be so aligned. Therefore, it makes sense for India to keep its relationship with Russia in good repair. Those assumptions, I hope, will continue to be valid going forward. But as you know, I mean, the situation is changing so rapidly, virtually by the hour. We are finding it very difficult to really gauge what is it that we will end up with once this, particular conflict, in some sense, plays itself out one way or the other.
And so with the United States, the other player in this, with which there seems to be some kind of disagreement, if one can say, or not being on the same, not reading from the same sheet, so to speak. The United States would understand the kind of compulsions India is facing, and we would be able to make up if there is any gaps in our thinking as we go forward once the situation in Europe stabilizes a bit.
I think you may not necessarily find a great deal of understanding as far as the US civil society is concerned, as far as US mainstream media is concerned, which would want India to stand up and be counted. But I think as far as US decision makers are concerned, they would, I'm sure, understand what are the kind of constraints under which India has to operate. This is not the first time that such a situation has arisen. And while there may have been some hiccups in terms of our relationship with the West, ultimately those relationships have proved to be very resilient and have actually continued to expand. So I have no reason to believe that even though there may be some dissatisfaction with the votes that India has taken at the United Nations, that this would have a serious, impact on our relationship. Do not forget that as far as the United States is concerned, it is not as if tomorrow the confrontation with China will end. And if that confrontation still is something which United States of America considers a major challenge to its interests, and even in a converse sense, if it has less attention that it can pay to that challenge. Perhaps the importance of India in that context will probably increase rather than decrease.
But then you have also argued in your pieces that it is highly possible that the United States could start engaging with China and find a modus vivendi to focus more on Europe, and that could put India in a weaker situation.
So these are scenarios that we should be looking at. May not necessarily happen, but we should be looking at. I can see, for example, a situation where, as a result of the Ukraine crisis, Russia becomes an even lesser power than it is today. That its capacity to threaten Europe or the United States of America is even more diminished than it has been in the past. In this case, there is really no reason, especially with the heightened kind of military preparedness which you now see in Europe, that they need to worry so much about a Russian threat going forward. In which case, then they should be able to focus attention much more on the main challenge, main adversary, which is China. That is one scenario. The second scenario is that the Russian threat, as a result of whatever may be the outcome of this Ukraine war, that particular threat lingers on and perhaps even gets heightened. In which case, whether we like it or not, the attention of the United States of America and the attention of Western Europe will in fact be focused much more on Russia. If that is the case, and if they find that there is need to perhaps look at the European balance by trying to somehow reduce the threat that they are facing from Russia, what is the best way to do it? If you are engaged on two fronts, you try to minimize the danger on at least one front while you are dealing with this. So I would not exclude that there may be arguments within the United States that it is important for the United States to focus attention on what is really its European space, because after all, the United States is an extension of Europe in one sense. So this is more important. And if this is more important, Indo-Pacific is still somewhat far away. So maybe we need to come to some kind of an understanding with China. There are major concerns that China has, not very different from what Russia had with regard to its own periphery. Whether it is the Taiwan issue or whether it is deployments, US forward deployments very close to its eastern coast. Now, if China says, well, if we have to reach an understanding, you have to then accommodate our interest in this region, which is the most important for us. So that scenario is something that we should not exclude, and what its implications will be for us. But the bottom line is, whatever external balancing that we do, whatever the adjustments that we do, ultimately what is going to count is your own domestic capabilities in terms of your economic capabilities, in terms of your military capabilities, technological capabilities. These are what will eventually count the most in terms of safeguarding your overall interests. I would say that the external balancing can be the supplement, but it should not be the main dish in a sense. There is no escape from that.
So my final question to you: so, what is the best case scenario that we can hope for in this kind of a situation with whatever is going on in Europe and elsewhere?
Well, the best case scenario would be that at least the lines of communication have been kept open, that the first round of talks have taken place between Russia and Ukraine. A second round of talks are also slated. It would be my hope that there is some silver lining on these dark clouds, and that can be a ceasefire. Perhaps the Russians may come to the conclusion that this is not working the way that they had perhaps envisaged, and it's better to cut your losses and settle for whatever you can get, rather than continue with something which will bog you down even further. That could be the best case scenario. And of course, in that context, that the West Europeans and the Americans don't see this as an opportunity to pile on further, but be ready to come to also some kind of a mutual accommodation with Russia. I think Russian leverage has diminished, to my mind, whichever way, as I said, this conflict concludes. You have also seen the fact that there are demonstrations, public demonstrations in Russia itself, and as the sanctions start biting, the ordinary lives of people will also be impacted, and therefore that will have a impact in terms of Putin's popularity. So will that also be taken into account in terms of decisions that Putin now takes? Maybe. He's still in a very commanding position, but these things can change, very, very rapidly. You have seen how Zelensky, within the space of about 2 weeks, from being he's been a comedian and he was an actor, he's not really up to, dealing with this situation. And he has suddenly, emerged as almost like a statesman, a leader who's like a hero, standing with his people, not ready to abandon them. To the extent that these images count, on the television screens all over the world, Putin seems to have lost the public relations battle. Now you can say, this is because the West is dominating the media. Maybe, but even if it is dominance of media, the images that are going around the world are doing Russia no good.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Saran. This was really, really fascinating. Thank you for listening. For more information on our work, follow us on Twitter at CPR_India and log on to our website at www.cprindia.org.